I've got a slide of the Texas-New Mexico line.
For those of you who are interested in the paper that Dr. Gonzalez Oropesa mentioned that he had written, it will be available on the San Jacinto Battleground Conservancy website. David Singleton tells me, but before too many days, or maybe a couple of weeks, it will be available very soon on the website. So you don't need to ask us to email it to you or to send it to you. It's going to be available on the website. We're going to keep covering the borders of Texas, more on the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande is such an important boundary and such a controversial one that we're going to have two people speaking about that. Our second is Dr. Jerry Thompson, and then we'll get to those straight lines across the American West that I mentioned earlier on today. But first, let me introduce Dr. Jerry Thompson, who's been teaching Texas history now for, I believe, around 45 years. Most of that time at the institution now known as Texas A&M International University in Laredo, where he is Regents Professor of History. He has written numerous books and edited many as well. His most recent of those 20 or so books is Civil War and Revolution on the Rio Grande Frontier, which has won not only the T.R. Fehrenbach Award, but also the Kate Brooks Bates Award for the best book in Texas history. My particular favorite of Jerry's books is called 50 Miles and a Fight, because we have a mutual interest in a man named Samuel Peter Heinzelman. I've learned his name was Old Sourdough, his nickname. I'm interested in him because he was the business partner and obituary writer for one Hermann Ehrenberg, who you'll hear about more someday whenever I finish that damn book. But watch this space. Ehrenberg is going to be coming soon. But the reason I'm so I have so much admiration for Jerry is because Heinzelman's handwriting, from which Jerry has produced this partial version of his journal and the annotations and explanation. Heinzelman's handwriting was so lousy that Heinzelman couldn't read it, and so that by his own admission. And so Jerry has done a real job for all of us in bringing that book, 50 Miles and a Fight, Samuel Peter Heinzelman's Journal of Texas and the Cortina War. Heinzelman was here in Texas before the Civil War, fought for the Union not very well, I'm afraid, during the Civil War, and then came back during Reconstruction. And it was when he was in Galveston that he learned of Hermann Ehrenberg's death in the far west in California, and wrote a brief obituary for the for Flake's Galveston Weekly, which was then copied by the New York Times 2 weeks later. It took me a year and a half to figure out who wrote that obituary, but it was almost certainly Samuel Peter Heinzelman. I was fortunate enough to have Jerry as my guide through the old town of Laredo, the capital of the once Republic of the Rio Grande, a place that was contested by Texas briefly a few times during the period of the Republic, but certainly never held. Jerry lives through Laredo's summers, which is enough to give him a hero medal himself. But he has an encyclopedic knowledge of the period of the from the Republic of Texas up through the early state of Texas and into the Civil War, with special expertise on the Civil War on the Rio Grande. I am eager to hear what he's going to tell us about that boundary and what it has meant for Texas over the years. Dr. Jerry Thompson.
Thank you kindly, Jim. Some of those summers I retreat to New Mexico. They can be indeed brutal in Laredo in the summer. I'm happy to be in Houston today. In fact, at my age, I'm happy to be anywhere. Or in, I think what David called the great goat roping contest or something. I always like to start my presentations with a piece of humor, and I thought since I'm coming from Laredo and live so close to the border, I would share with you the latest Laredo joke. And you almost have to be a World War II veteran to appreciate this. I told this to a couple of my students, and they didn't laugh, and I figured out later why they didn't understand it. But these two guys were getting on an airplane in New York, and it was very, very obvious that that one man was kind of agitated and looked kind of depressed, and they finally got on the airplane, and about an hour into the flight, they got to talking to one another, and the guy says, well, what's wrong? He said, oh my God, he said, I'm being transferred down there to the Texas-Mexican border, and said not only that, to Laredo, and said they've got this vicious drug war going on down there, and hell, I might be killed. I can't take my family down there. I just don't know what to do. And the guy said, look, he said, I've lived there for 30 years, and said, you know, people don't understand that there's a Laredo, Texas, and there's a Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, and all that violence is across the river, and said, don't worry, you're going to be fine there, just don't worry. So about 2 hours into the flight, the guy that was moving to Laredo turned to the other guy, and he said, by the way, what do you do down there in Laredo? He says, I'm a tail gunner on a bread truck. But if students don't know what a tail gunner is, then it's, you know, there's no humor to that at all. And while I'm on a roll here, I was thinking of another piece of humor when Gene was speaking this morning, and it's the story of those two Texas cowboys that were driving to Louisiana, and they saw this name on the map there. Looked a lot like Nacogdoches, Texas, but they couldn't pronounce this. And they were arguing about, well, you know, how do you say the name of this place we're coming to? Of course, it was Nacogdoches. And the one cowboy says, well, when we get into town, he said, I'm just going to stop and find out. So just as they pulled into Nacogdoches, he pulled into a Dairy Queen there, and they went in and asked the young lady, said, how do you pronounce the name of this place? She says, Dairy Queen. So maybe we better stop and be serious. My job today is to discuss the events on the Texas-Mexican border in the years following the Treaty of Velasco and the battle at San Jacinto, up and through the war with Mexico in 1848, and I guess all the way up to the Compromise of 1850, or really the compromises. It's more than one. We always say Compromise of 1850. It's really a series of compromises. But I really would recommend to you, if you're seriously interested in this period, a couple of books that were written by a kind of cantankerous historian a number of years ago who taught at A&M by the name of John Nance. And John Nance wrote two books. He wrote one called After San Jacinto, and then he wrote a second book called Attack and Counterattack. Now, reading the books themselves will put you to sleep, but I use them for encyclopedias because they've got anything that anybody would ever want to know about that period of history. And then he worked the latter part of his life on the Mier expedition and produced about a 1,200-page manuscript that nobody was willing to publish. And finally, Archie MacDonald edited that down, and that was published, and I really recommend that, on the Mier expedition. But like I said, all of those books are really almost like encyclopedias. I think we all know about the Treaty of Velasco. Some of you know a lot more than I do. And of course, we all know about that very eventful day in 1836 on April the 21st. Certainly one of the most significant battles, I think, in world history. Certainly the most important 18 minutes in the history of Texas. And I don't think anyone really at the time realized the real long-term impact of that battle. As many as 650 to 700 Mexican soldiers lay dead. As many as 730 were held as captives. The so-called Napoleon of the West had been vanquished, but would of course reappear when he goes to Washington. And you saw this morning that people in Mexico really don't like this guy Santa Anna because he gave away so much land. So they kind of joke in Mexico that his own real contribution to history was that he introduced chicle into the United States. And I think that is a true story. I think he did give some of that to President Andrew Jackson when they were able to meet. I think that is a true story. But that really was a crushing defeat for Santa Anna and a large part of the Mexican army. We sometimes forget that he did not command the entire army in Texas. And the question this morning was, well, why didn't they just shoot him? Well, Houston said, quote, Santa Anna dead is no more than Tom, Dick, or Harry dead, but living he may avail Texas much. Well, of course, that much turned out to be that Treaty of Velasco that was signed on May the 14th on the Texas coast at the mouth of the Brazos River at that small community of Velasco. And there were actually two treaties of Velasco, as some of you know. One was public and then one was private. But in that Treaty of Velasco, Santa Anna, of course, agreed to end hostilities in Texas, to order the withdrawal of the Mexican army. Now, whether they're going to follow his orders or not is another question. But he agreed, I think, more importantly, to the Rio Grande as the boundary. I think that's the real significant part of that treaty. Now, the Rio Grande had never been a significant boundary to that part in history. The Nueces had always been kind of the boundary between Coahuila in Texas and Nuevo Santander, and then later the state of Tamaulipas. So at that point, the Rio Grande really did not have that much significance. But it was included in that private treaty, and therefore, as of 1836, the Republic of Texas claims the Rio Grande instead of the Nueces as the boundary line between these two infant republics. Now, we need to emphasize, as we'll learn later, that the Texas Republic also claimed all of that land west to the, well, if you can't see it hardly, all the way west over here to the Rio Grande. And Chris was making fun this morning of that Texas boundary that extended all the way up there into Wyoming. But that is the boundary that the Texans claimed as of 1836, which includes those little small adobe villages of places like Santa Fe and places like Albuquerque. That is claimed as part of the Republic of Texas. Now, in December of 1838, when Maribel B. Lamar became the second president of the Republic of Texas, if you don't count the interim president, as you know, his foreign policy was far more aggressive than that of Houston, especially in relation to the indigenous peoples of Texas, especially the Cherokee, as you know. And so that brings us to our very, very interesting Republic of the Rio Grande. And Randall was kind enough to share with us this flag that I've put on display up here. And my friend in Mexico City, not my friend in Mexico City, my friend Dr. Green from Laredo, who has been doing research in Mexico City, found a sketch, which fortunately is a colored sketch in the archives there. And it appears as if that bottom color that we have dark, at least in my observation of that colored copy he has, it appears to me as if that may be green, which would make a lot more sense than being black. So we really don't know the exact colors of that flag, but certainly the three stars represented the three states of Nuevo Leon, Coahuila, and Tamaulipas. Now, how did this Republic of the Rio Grande come about? Well, it's part of this continuous struggle in Mexico between the forces of federalism and centralism that had been going on ever since the Mexican Republic had been founded in 1821. And when we think of these Mexican federalists, please don't confuse those federalists with the American federalists. They're really two different breeds of people. The Federalists in the United States, guys like Washington and Hamilton, were very interested in a strong central government, as we see in the Constitution, parts of the Constitution. But in Mexico, the Federalists were the ones who really kind of wanted a weak central government and much more rights given to the individual states, such as the rights to select their own governors, officials, etc. Whereas the centralists, like Santa Anna, who started out as a Federalist and became a centralist, they're more interested in consolidating that power in Mexico. So I think when we see the formation of this Republic of the Rio Grande in 1840, we need to see it in this light of these continuous struggles that were going on in Mexico. And as we learned this morning, Santa Anna has big problems in the Yucatan. He has big problems in Zacatecas, not just Texas. Well, in 1840, a group of these Mexican Federalists met there on the Rio Grande, on the north bank, we think probably in modern-day Zapata County, downriver from Webb County, which is where Laredo is, and they drew up a constitution with a man by the name of Jesus Cardenas as president. Antonio Canales was selected to head the army, and they eventually wound up setting up their capital in Laredo. So we take great pride, or at least the Chamber of Commerce takes great pride, in saying that Laredo really was under more flags than was the Republic of Texas. And then recently, a couple of years ago, I went up to Eagle Pass, and they were opening their 8 Flags Museum. And I said, well, where'd you get that 8th flag? We in Laredo have 7, but all of a sudden you have 8. And the guy said, we want to count the Comanche lance. So somehow they were trying to outdo Laredo. But the real hero, I think, in this Republic of the Rio Grande, one of the most fascinating individuals, which Zapata County is named after. A lot of people in Zapata County even think the county was named after the 20th century revolutionary hero Emiliano Zapata. It's actually named after this guy, Antonio Zapata, who was a rancher in the area who becomes one of the leaders. Canales is not very good, so Antonio Zapata becomes the real leader, at least the cavalry commander of this Republic of the Rio Grande. And he was eventually captured, court-martialed, and executed. And they recently found the court-martial proceedings in Mexico City, and was beheaded, much as Father Hidalgo had been beheaded. And not only did the Mexican centralists behead him, they took his head and put it in a cask of mezcal and brought it down to Laredo, and then proceeded to put it on display in the plaza there for any Federalist to see as a symbol that you don't revolt against the Mexican government. And then they took it downriver to his hometown of Guerrero and put it on a pike on the plaza there across the street from his family. So can you imagine every day looking out and seeing your father's head on a stick out there in the plaza in Guerrero? And there's a very good historian who studied here at the University of Houston who wrote his very good master's thesis on the Republic of the Rio Grande, and he found where the priest in Guerrero performed a funeral mass for the head. Now, we don't know about the torso, but certainly there was a mass for the head. And he also found in the records there where Antonio Zapata is clearly listed as mulatto, which is very interesting and something that I did not know before. But eventually the centralists crushed this Republic of the Rio Grande. Canales fled, came to San Antonio, went eventually to Victoria, eventually to Austin, met with President Mirabeau B. Lamar. And of course, Texas is very interested in this Republic of the Rio Grande. There's a lot of correspondence that fly back and forth because the Republic of the Rio Grande could serve as a perfect buffer between Texas and Mexico, but there's not much of a discussion as to what would be the boundaries of this new Republic of the Rio Grande, because clearly they would want the Nueces and not the Rio Grande as the boundary. But Canales tried to rebuild his army, not only made up of Mexicans, but also a lot of Anglo-Texans and a few Native Americans, and then eventually was captured or defeated at Ciudad Victoria. And there's a lot of intrigue in this. He kind of really went over to the other side. So that Republic of the Rio Grande only lasted really for about 243 tumultuous days. But those were very, very interesting days. Now, Lamar is also responsible the next year in 1841 of launching something that you heard quite a bit about this morning, which is that ill-fated Santa Fe expedition under General Hugh McLeod. There's a new biography of the general. He was a West Point graduate and should have known what he was doing. And we were discussing last night how one of the men who went with McLeod was Jose Antonio Navarro from the Texas Revolution fame that maybe we'll hear more about next year. But in all, there were 321 men, soldiers, artillerymen, teamsters, 21 ox-drawn wagons loaded down with supplies. Merchants had about $200,000 in goods, which is a lot. And they called themselves the Santa Fe Pioneers, and saw this really kind of as a commercial attempt to tie Texas to Santa Fe. I think what the Texans really wanted was control of the Santa Fe Trail that proved to be quite lucrative economically. If you could get hold to the southern end of that and lobby the same tariffs that the Mexicans were, you could make a lot of money from that trade. So what they were offering the Nuevo Mexicanos was the opportunity to kind of join this new infant Republic of Texas. On June 19, 1841, the expedition set out from Kinney's Fort on Brush Creek, about 20 miles north of Austin. And they didn't know much about the geography of West Texas, so they traveled across the Brazos, then west across the cross timbers, kind of past what is modern-day Wichita Falls. They're getting really close to the Red River. And then they turned west, harassed by the Comanches as they went, running low on provisions, ran out of water a couple of times, could not find a very good route or a suitable route to get the wagons up the Caprock, and spent days trying to do that. And they finally decided, as they were running out of steam and water and everything else, to send an advance party on ahead to contact the Nuevo Mexicanos. And they made contact with some Comancheros near the little village, it's still a little village today, of Anton Chico. And the governor of New Mexico, very famous during the war that was to follow, Manuel Armijo, decided that these guys really were a bunch of bandits, and not only captured the advance party, but then captured the other group that was following them maybe 150 miles behind along the Canadian River near modern-day Tucumcari, and put them in chains and sent them all the way down the Rio Grande across the Chihuahuan Desert all the way to Mexico City. So the Santa Fe expedition in reality turned out to be a disaster. But and I don't think I'm having the same problem let me go backwards. Somewhere I had yeah, there we go. George Wilkin Kendall's famous, well-received book, Narrative of the Texan Santa Fe Expedition, was widely read. And I think what that served to do was really arouse people in Texas, people in the United States, as to the suffering of the Santa Fe prisoners who were, as I said, taken all the way to Mexico City, and some of them thrown into Perote prison that you'll see in a moment. And that really became a piece of diplomatic contention between Mexico and the United States trying to get these guys freed, and even the government of Great Britain becomes very much involved in this. And some of them were released in April of 1842. And don't forget the name of that book, Attack and Counterattack. Largely as a result of the Santa Fe expedition and the kind of wild actions of the Texas Navy, the new president of Mexico, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, decides to send an expedition into Texas under General Rafael Vasquez. And Vasquez actually crosses the Rio Grande in March of 1842 with 1,400 men and actually takes San Antonio de Bejar, raises the Mexican flag, and declared Texas under Mexican law. Now, he withdrew a couple of days later, but he took back with him about 100 prisoners that he took in San Antonio, including guys like Samuel Maverick. Now, by this time, Texas has a new president for the second time, Sam Houston. And Sam Houston has got to retaliate to this somehow, so he raises a small army under General Alexander Somerville. Houston's kind of trying to play for time and trying to, I think, promote peace as best as he can, and Somerville is not overly excited about organizing this army. But when they finally do get underway, after they had agreed to sell something like 10 million acres of land to raise money, they have all kinds of problems getting down to the Rio Grande. They get caught in some swamps there in Atascosa County. The Nueces River is flooded, and they have a hard time getting across that. But the Somerville expedition finally arrives in Laredo. And although Laredo is on the north bank of the river, they proceed to just sack the community. They stole everything conceivable. Some of the guys were drunk. They took logs as battering ramps and battered down the doors. There's inventories in the Laredo archives of the items that they took. Somerville just completely lost control of the army. And the guys said that they even found something strange in the town that looked kind of like tobacco, that you could smoke it, and it kind of made you feel kind of strange. So these Texans were having a really, I think, really great time in Laredo. And when Somerville finally got them to return all the items that they had stolen, he said that it amounted to the size of a small house. And at that point, he's kind of so disgusted with all of this that he just basically throws up his arms and says, well, I'm going back to San Antonio. But some of these very, very determined Texans, under a gentleman by the name of Fisher, Tom Green, decide that they will continue down the river. And that's where I was trying to show you the Navy of the Republic of Texas. Now, Dr. Nance used to get really excited when you dare refer to this as the Navy of the Republic of Texas. He claims at this point that this Navy was totally illegitimate, but they certainly raised their Texas flag, and they did have some small boats. And although this is greatly exaggerated, there's no cliffs along the Rio Grande that even look like that. There's no doubt that some of these guys did sail down the river, and they did claim to be part of the Texas Navy. Now let me continue on with the story if I can. I've lost my notes, but that's okay. They get down to Guerrero, where they force a loan on the alcalde there, and then they proceed. They were on the south bank by this time. They proceed from Guerrero all the way down to Mier and actually take Mier. And they're in Mier when they're basically attacked by a much larger Mexican army, and a fierce fight goes on there a few days before Christmas. And the Texans basically were fighting from house to house, rooftop to rooftop. This is a furious fight. But they were so greatly outnumbered that they eventually ran out of ammunition and everything possible, and eventually surrendered. So I think at that point, the Somerville expedition kind of becomes what we call the Mier expedition. And these guys, like the Santa Fe expedition, are put in chains. They're marched down the south bank of the river through these small communities like Camargo, all the way to Matamoros. There's big ceremonies, bands play, there's wreaths that are put out in the streets, and then they're marched all the way to Monterrey and then into the mountains to Saltillo. And then you know the story from there, I think. They start into the desert, and they get way down there in the middle of that desert, about halfway to Matehuala on the road to San Luis Potosi, and at a kind of ranch headquarters, a hacienda in the desert there at Salado, they decide to make a break and kill some of their Mexican guards and escaped into the desert. Well, that's the worst conceivable place to try and escape because there's no water, there's no food there. Most of the guys were either recaptured or some just disappeared. Very few ever made it back to Texas. Well, then that's ends up in the famous drawing of the black beans at Salado. And somewhere here I've got the exact number of guys who drew the black beans, 17 misfortunate guys who drew the black bean. Bigfoot Wallace said that he was watching carefully and he noticed that those black beans were bigger than the white beans. Black bean meant death, a white bean meant that you could survive. So as he was reaching in the earthen jar, he could tell that some beans were larger than others and drew a white bean. Now this image, there are others, but this is probably the most famous one by Frederick Remington, was made in 1896, drawing of the black beans. Look at something very interesting. Look at these Mexican soldiers here. And I don't know if Frank is around, but I've never seen Mexican soldiers that look exactly like or have uniforms exactly like these guys. But Jim, are you looking carefully? Chris can give you a really great lecture on the art of the Alamo in San Jacinto at this period of American history and the racism that's involved. Look at some of these Mexican soldiers and how Remington depicts them. This particular guy here looks exactly like a monkey. And you remember some of those guys in the Alamo painting you were pointing out that have those that similar facial features. And I mean, you see the real people, and they've done this with generals in the Mexican War. You see the real Mexican generals, and then you see the way they were depicted, and they're depicted as being guys with big mustaches and kind of evil looking, and then you see the real photograph, and they don't look at all like that. So I think this has a tinge of racism in it. But those 17 guys were blindfolded and taken out into an adjacent yard and just simply shot there. And that's not where the story ends. This guy, I think, is one of the most interesting individuals in all of Texas history. And I'm sure you have heard of this. John Christopher Columbus Hill. Don't you think everybody should have 4 names, not just 3 names or 2 names? John Christopher Columbus Hill. He was 14 years old when he was captured at Mier, along with his brother and his father. His brother was a little older than he was. But he was befriended by the Mexican general and somehow sent to Santa Ana. And Santa Ana basically adopted this kid and sent him off to the Colegio, the School of Mining in Mexico City, which was one of the better universities there at that time. He also became a physician while he was in Mexico. The U.S. Minister to Mexico, Waddy Thompson, called him a very shrewd and handsome little fellow, and really got a great education there, came to be known as Juan Cristobal Gil, G-I-L instead of H-I-L-L. Became quite distinguished, not only as a physician, but as a mining engineer, a civil engineer. Married in Mexico, had 4 children. My good friend Mary Margaret has written this biography, A Brave Boy and a Good Soldier. And the story doesn't end there. He sent his son to Swarthmore College in the United States, returned back to Texas in 1895, moved to Austin and became a translator there for the General Land Office. Wow. And in 1897 became an honorary life member of the Texas State Historical Association and died in Monterey in February of 1904 and is buried there. So he has to be one of the most fascinating individuals in all of Texas history, I think. The boy survivor of the Muir expedition. Now, an armistice was kind of formally declared in June of 1943, and most of the prisoners who had been in Mexico, they were at Perote prison. And if you go to Perote today, halfway on the road between, say, Jalapa and Puebla, Perote looks today pretty much the way it did back then. It's still this almost like a medieval fortress. This is a view from the different direction. You can see 8,000-foot Pico de Orizaba in the background. I did a paper one time on the Americans who climbed these high volcanoes during the war with Mexico. Few people realize that Mexico has the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th highest mountains in North America. But that's kind of a contemporary sketch of the Perote prison. Some of the Texans, like Tom Green, got out of there. Some of them were able to get all the way back to Texas. Jose Antonio Novato was sent down to Veracruz and put in the prison there of San Juan de Ulloa, which is a much more dreary place than this on the coast. And he was able to escape from there and make it all the way back to Texas. His story is as interesting almost as that of the boy hero Hill. But let me point out something that's really significant. Texas continues, as a result of the Treaty of Velasco, to claim the Rio Grande. Let's go back to one of those maps if we can. I forgot to tell you the rest of the story. Sorry. During the war with Mexico, following the Battle of Buena Vista, the biggest battle in the war by far, some of these Texans went back into the desert, like 100 miles back into the desert, to Salado, and they forced the alcalde there, the leader of this small community, to show them where the prisoners who had been executed were buried. And so the remains of these Texans were dug up, placed in wagons, and they were brought all the way back to Texas and reburied in one of the more beautiful places in Texas, at Monument Hill there, overlooking the river, the Colorado River, near LaGrange. And so if you ever get in that LaGrange area, by all means, go visit Monument Hill. There's some inaccuracies in the big monument that is there, but it's at least contains the bones of those who were executed at Salado as a result of the Muir expedition. Under diplomatic pressure, as I said, most of those Muir prisoners, Santa Fe expedition prisoners, were eventually released. Now, in the meantime, the Mexicans had invaded Texas a second time under General Wool. So twice during the Republic of Texas, they crossed the Rio Grande. Wool got as deep into Texas as Vasquez had the previous year. But I'm running out of time here, so let me quickly do the rest of the story for you. And I think the rest of the story most of you know. In 1844, James K. Polk is elected President of the United States. That is really a momentous election. I think had Henry Clay been elected, that entire period of history could have been very, 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 very different. In December of 1849, Polk, of course, signs the Texas Annexation Act. So after about 10 years, Texas now became part of the United States. Now, when Texas becomes part of the United States, the United States basically inherits that Treaty of Velasco, inherits that claim to the Rio Grande and not the Nueces. Now, by 1845, Mexico had pretty well given up hope that they were ever going to be able to regain Texas, something they had somewhat, really wanted and really desired. But that has become so impractical, they realize Texas is probably lost. But they will not acknowledge the Rio Grande as the boundary. Mexico continues to insist on the Nueces. Now, the Nueces is that small stream that starts up here in the hill country, makes its way south, not too far from Uvalde, and then it kind of turns east and then empties into the Gulf at Corpus Christi. Very, very small stream. Well, Mexico insists on the Nueces as the boundary. Well, Polk in 1846 and 1845 sends the American army to Corpus Christi. Corpus Christi was just a little smuggling town of about 400 people living on a bluff there. And all of a sudden you got this big American army under Zachary Taylor. And then in the spring of 1846, then of course Polk gives the green light for Taylor to move south all the way from the Nueces, all the way from Corpus Christi, all the way down here to the Rio Grande, where Taylor began constructing this large earthen embankment, Fort Texas, which will become Fort Brown after Major Brown, who died in the fighting there. But that's direct defiance of the Mexican army that's right across the river. And Zachary Taylor even raises the American flag there, we think on probably a cottonwood pole. Some people say he just took the tongue of a wagon and raised it there. And these emails fly back and forth across the river there. And of course, everybody was very polite back then. My dear sir, get your ass out of here. And then the Mexican general writes back, and he's equally, oh, my dear sir, I can't do it. This is Mexican soil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you just begin to see these war clouds just lowering over the Rio Grande there. And then, of course, this occurs when the Mexican army crossed the Rio Grande and attacked a company of dragoons at a place called Carecitos upriver, and then that is the pretext that Polk uses as to declare war on Mexico in 1846. And then Taylor is involved in a big battle there at Palo Alto. It's not the biggest battle in Texas. What's the biggest battle in Texas, Dr. Chris?
Medina.
Very good, you passed the class. But Palo Alto is big. The battle that followed that, Resaca de la Palma, is also a bloodbath. The Mexican army is driven across the river, and very quickly, this is the Mexican War in 3 minutes. Taylor will proceed into the interior. He will take steamboats, go up the Rio Grande all the way to Camargo. This is the way King and Kennedy made most of their money, was by steamboat contracting during the war. And then, very adventuresome, Taylor will advance across the desert, attack Monterrey. That is a ferocious battle. That's 10 times the Battle of Mier. It's house to house, street to street. It's the only battle that I know where American casualties actually came to outnumber those of the Mexican army. But the Mexican army eventually raises a white flag and agrees to retreat. And then Taylor will proceed in and capture the old capital of Coahuila in Texas at Saltillo. But he's very fearful of advancing south across that 300-mile desert there, for fear that the Mexicans will come in and poison the water holes, and he just doesn't want to get caught out in the middle of nowhere. So he's just basically sitting there when Santa Anna, who has raised a new army, marches north, kind of the same army that he had taken into Texas in 1836. It's largely an army of conscripted Indians, but he does have some crack troops with him. And when Santa Anna attacked Taylor's army, on the first day of the Battle of Buena Vista there, it looked as if Santa Anna was going to win a decisive victory. And then the morning of the second day, the Americans looked out and the campfires had been left burning in the night and the Mexican soldiers had left. Santa Anna retreats south, claiming that he had won a great victory. He has American weapons to prove it. But in reality, he had been defeated, and that turns out to really be decisive, because that gives Taylor complete control of northeastern Mexico. And then, of course, a small American army, the Army of the West, marched all the way along the Santa Fe Trail to capture Santa Fe when General Manuel Armijo, the same guy from the Santa Fe expedition, agreed to give up the city without a fight. And historians are pretty well convinced today that what happened was that General Kearny's quartermaster, a guy by the name of McGoffin, he and a couple of friends just went into Santa Fe and we think just bribed Armijo. There's about $2,800 in quartermaster dollars that somehow just disappear there. And Armijo just retreats. So all the history books say that the conquest of New Mexico was bloodless, but there's a couple of footnotes to that. After the American army occupied New Mexico, There's an uprising there led, we think, by a priest in Taos against the Americans, and then there's an uprising in another community of Mora, and the American army just went in and smashed that, just brought in artillery and blew down the church in Taos on top of the insurrectionists. So maybe the initial conquest was bloodless, but then there was fighting that followed. Now, the Americans have their hands full with the Native Americans in New Mexico, especially the Navajo, but Kearny continues west as Doniphan continues south all the way, fighting down here for control of Chihuahua, and then he eventually will go all the way down here and join Taylor at Saltillo. But Kearny, of course, will march all the way west, led by Colonel Christopher Carson. And then out here in California, of course, you've got the Bear Flag Republic. But Mexico continues to fight on. So Polk will send Winfield Scott with a large army down here to Veracruz. They will land almost 10,000 men in a matter of a day, one of the most successful, largest, really first big amphibious landing in American history. They will lay siege to Veracruz. Now, Santa Anna is an amazing person. I think we, vilify him because of what happened at the Alamo, but we kind of sometimes lose track of him and his ability to lead an army. He goes back down here, regroups the Mexican army, and tries to hold Taylor down here in what we call the Tierra Caliente, which is really full of disease beyond imagination. You cannot keep an army there on that coast. You got yellow fever, everything you can imagine. So he thinks if he can hold the Americans there, he can still win the war. Well, Scott, who is probably the best of the American commanders, I think he's better than Taylor, he will come up here and decisively defeat Santa Anna at Cerro Gordo. And when you go to Mexico, it's one of the few places that you can still see the original battlefield there. And not only did they defeat Santa Anna, they basically chased him in his stagecoach, and some guys from the Midwest actually captured his wooden leg. He had lost a leg in a battle with the French in the Pastry War, and the guys indignantly carved their initials on it, and you can see that, I think, in a museum in Springfield today. And then there's fighting all the way around Mexico City itself. I mean, vicious, vicious fighting at Molina del Rey and Contreras and Churubusco. And then finally the Americans are at the gate of Mexico City itself, lay siege to Chapultepec. And if we have people from Mexico, please don't throw anything. But the Mexican historians today have pretty well figured out that story of the boy heroes of Chapultepec, that is probably something that Mexico concocted as late as 20, 30 years after the war itself, because she had been so humiliated and she badly needed heroes. But every American president that goes to Mexico City today goes and lays this wreath at the place where it is thought that these boy cadets died near Chapultepec. And so that is such a part of Mexican history today that if you dare challenge that south of the Rio Grande, you're really taking your life into your own hands. So the Americans will take Mexico City itself, and basically the war is over. Santa Anna had fled north to San Luis Potosi, and I didn't think he had that much to do with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that concluded the war. But in that treaty, the United States will take almost 50% of Mexican territory. Now, only a small part of the population, only about 60,000 people if you don't count the indigenous peoples, but the United States took almost 50% of the territory of Mexico. So every morning when I get out and I walk out my front door, I can glance off to my left in Laredo, and I can see this huge Mexican flag flying on the border. It is a flag that is almost the size of a football field. It cost, I think, almost 40,000 at that time, 40,000 pesos. I mean, huge, beyond imagination. Now, the Americans have built a big flag themselves, but not quite that big. But I think what Mexico is doing with that flag is sending a message. And I think they're saying, okay, you gringos, you can't have any more land. You just can't have any more land. This is it. This is Mexico. You can't have any more land. But most of my students in Laredo, about 90% of them are Hispanic, and we frankly discuss these things in my Texas history class, and they tell me, and these are Latinos, we ain't giving it back.